Today we're reading The Naming of Ginger Pie, Chapter 4. Gracie the cat took an immediate liking to the new member of the family. She was not at all jealous. After her first long, incredulous stare when they were introduced the next morning, she tried to give the puppy a good washing. He accepted a lick or two, but he wouldn't stay still long enough for more, and he made a game of it. When he got too impudent, Gracie gave him a cuffing, but she kept her claws in. And if he came pouncing on her during her nap, she spit at him. But all in all, her feelings toward the puppy were tolerant and kindly. In the bright light of morning, it seemed nonsense to even remember about the mysterious footstepper. Nevertheless, Jerry rushed over to Mrs. Speedy's the first thing the next morning to find out who the fellow was who had also wanted to buy his dog. He wanted some idea, besides a hat, as to whom to be on guard against. But instead of Mrs. Speedy leading the cows to pasture, he found Mr. Speedy. Mr. Speedy said Mrs. Speedy had been struck in the night with a stroke and would be in the hospital for some time. Mr. Speedy was not the friendly type. He didn't like the children standing around watching him milk or churn or mow. Anyway, with Mrs. Speedy sick, Jerry couldn't ask him if Mrs. Speedy had ever told him the odd thing of two people wanting to buy the same puppy. Jerry being one, the other being a mystery. So he raced back home knowing nothing. This was Sunday, and everyone was so interested in watching the puppy, it was hard to do anything else. Rachel and Jerry were allowed to stay home from Sunday school just this once to play with the puppy. After all, they had spent yesterday in church, dusting pews to be sure, but in church nonetheless. Rachel appreciated the permission to stay home. However, she thought she'd better go to Sunday school anyway, just in case it had been the minister who stood in the doorway yesterday while she was dusting the pulpit, and not the mysterious footstepper. She was almost certain, no matter what Jerry thought, that it had been the minister. How would the footstepper ever have known she and Jerry were in church anyway? She didn't want to be cast out of the church for acting like a minister in the pulpit, and she imagined that perfect attendance at Sunday school would lessen that likelihood. She bade a reluctant farewell to her family and the new puppy and arrived at Sunday school just as the church, which came first, was letting out. Mr. Gandy was standing in the doorway shaking hands with all the people. The organ was still pealing joyously, and Rachel stood watching the congregation pour out and stream across the green. It was remarkable how differently she felt towards her church and the congregation now that she had dusted the pews. She didn't feel like the minister exactly, but she felt a rather protective fondness for the church. It would have pleased her to stand by the minister in the doorway and shake the hands of those he missed. We have a picture. Can you see her in her little dark coat? Had people noticed the special dusting the pews had? Rachel wondered. She examined the back of Miss Whittemeyer's white cotton embroidered dress to see if there was any dust on it, and there wasn't. She couldn't understand why they had to be so careful of Mrs. Whittemeyer's pew, because Mrs. Whittemeyer always brought one of her husband's big white handkerchiefs along with her and spread it out on the pew before sitting down. You would think they could skip dusting her part of the pew altogether, and likewise Judge Balls, for he did the same with his handkerchief, not caring to get a speck on his dark suit. Tall Sam Duty came grinning out of the church with a dark blue-purple suit on. It was not anywhere near as splendid a suit as the dark green one he had first, but naturally Rachel would not tell him this. At last she went into the parish house, wondering who had dusted it, and sat down in Mrs. Foot's class, which was just coming to order. To counteract her behavior in the pulpit, Rachel intended to make a good impression on the Sunday school teacher, but Miss Foot kept telling her please not fidget so. The truth was Rachel could not take her mind off the puppy any longer, and she was anxious to get home and see what cute things he was doing now. Moreover, she had given the minister a good chance to cast her out if he wanted to cast her out. She had stood right in front of him, practically inviting him to cast her out. Yet he had not done so. The chances were he was not ever going to do so. So now she might as well go home and see the puppy. The puppy! Goodness, they had forgotten to name him so far. They just called him Pup Pup. A dog couldn't go through life just being called Pup Pup. Supposing Uncle Benny had never been given a name, but was called Baby Baby all the time. It would be the same thing and all wrong. When finally Sunday school was let out, a little earlier than usual because a thunderstorm was coming up, she rushed home under the darkening sky. Suppose they had named the puppy while she was at Sunday school and she'd been left out of the naming. What are we going to name him? She asked, bursting into the house. To her surprise, Uncle Benny was there. He had not been able to wait until next Saturday to see the puppy again, and Grandma had had to bring him over in his Sunday clothes. Mama hadn't gotten the dinner ready yet. She'd been so interested in the puppy. Now she dropped the potato she was peeling and looked at the children in surprise. Why, she said, mean you haven't named him yet? Jerry felt ashamed. He had been so happy just having this dog, he hadn't even thought of naming him. Now he thought hard, however. He thought of all the names of the dogs he knew. They were Duke, Major, Rex, Queenie, Lassie, Lad, and Tige. He liked the name of Duke best, but that was the name of the big hound of his friend, Dick Badger, the hound that could scratch his stomach when you scratched his back. It was a very funny thing to watch, but this puppy of his was going to be funnier. This puppy of his, what would they name him? Naturally, there could not be two Dukes in the same block. Aren't you thinking? He asked Rachel. I am thinking, but I haven't thought of anything good enough yet. Well, think harder, said Jerry, while their puppy came racing through the house with a big fuzzy orange wool duster that he'd found earlier and appropriated for himself. There he stood in the doorway of the kitchen with a duster in his mouth, ready to tear off again. Catch me if you can, he seemed to say, taunting them, daring them to come, exceedingly impudent. Woof, he barked, dropping the duster. Jerry grabbed the handle end of the duster, and the puppy buried his nose in the wool end and worried it and shook it and growled and snorted. He was having a wonderful time, and so were all of them. Jerry held the duster high in the air, and the puppy hung onto it with his strong little teeth and swung. Look at that. Uncle Benny kept leaping up and down, yelling, Hey, hey! Thunder began to rumble, adding to the general confusion. The kitchen grew dark, and Mama had to light the gas mantle. At this rate, will I ever get dinner ready? Mama wondered. But the children hadn't even thought yet how hungry they were. They were too busy chasing the puppy and thinking of names. How about calling him Frisco, because he's so frisky, asked Jerry doubtfully, not at all sure this was a good name. They all said hesitantly. What about Boomernickels? Asked Rachel. Oh, Rachel, said Jerry in disgust. He was not always as careful about not hurting her feelings as she was his. I was just joking, said Rachel quickly. Uncle Benny said, Call Puppy Bumpy? Why Bumpy? They asked. Bumps into everything, he goes so fast, said Uncle Benny. This sounded like a very good name, but Jerry was not completely satisfied. It was the best so far, however. Then Mama said, Well, he looks like Ginger. He acts like Ginger. Why not call him Ginger? Ginger, they all repeated dubiously. None of them could think of anything better, though, and so they called this dog Ginger, and it went well with pie. Ginger pie. People will think it's gingerbread, and all the while it'll be ginger pie, said Rachel, who liked reasonableness. Rachel's reasonableness was not always easy for Jerry to agree with. There was quite often likely to be a catch to it. For instance, there was the time of the poisoned tomatoes. That time he and Rachel had been sitting on the back fence, just talking and thinking. They looked down in the yard behind them, which was overgrown with weeds, for the people were away that summer. Yet amidst the rampant weeds, a few sad-looking tomato plants were growing. And although through the weeds and plants, Rachel had spotted 3 beautiful, ripe red tomatoes. It was a marvel they could have grown so perfectly with all the weeds and burrs smothering them. But they had, and Jerry's mouth drooled hungrily, even now recollecting them. He had jumped over the fence and picked them and climbed back up, and had been all set to put his teeth in his when Rachel shouted at him so loud he nearly fell off the fence. Stop, she had yelled. Don't eat them, she said. They're poison, she had explained. Poison, he said. Yes, poison, she said. And she explained that though the people were away and the tomatoes would go to rot, they still couldn't eat them in the first place because that would be stealing. And in the second place, they were poison anyway, and they would die if they did. The stealing reason Jerry had discarded because he knew the neighbors well enough, and they would not have minded their tomatoes being eaten. In fact, they would have liked to have thought they weren't going to waste. The poison was another matter. Where had Rachel got the theory that tomatoes were poison? He asked her impatiently. She had got the theory, she said, from a story she had had just a few minutes before finished reading. The story was in a little book the Corn Fluffies people had sent out. In the story, some children who were supposed to not eat some certain fruit because it was poisoned had eaten the fruit and quickly became sick. If they had stuck to Corn Fluffies, they would not have become sick. Now, these tomatoes, she said, were in the same category. They were poison. Why else would they be growing down there amidst the burrs? Anyway, she talked so persuasively, she had Jerry convinced. And not only would she not let Jerry eat the tomatoes, she made them bury him deep in the earth of the lot across the street so the poison wouldn't spread all over the earth like the poison in the broken mirror in the story of the Snow Queen. That's all book stuff, Jerry had reasoned ruefully after it was all over, and Rachel had skipped off with Addie Egan. And why do I ever listen to her? He asked himself, half a mind to go back and dig the tomatoes up again. But why take a chance with poison? The poisoned tomatoes showed, though, exactly how unreasonable Rachel's reasonableness could be. When she did her most earnest talking was when you had to watch out. Was there a catch now to this ginger pie, gingerbread business? Jerry couldn't see a catch to it, so he said happily, Ginger is sort of a good name for him, isn't it? Sort of just great name. We'll call the puppy Ginger. All right. Ginger pie, not gingerbread, murmured Rachel dreamily. Ginger, who did not seem to care what he was named, or that he had been named, had fallen asleep under the kitchen table with one paw stretched in a proprietary fashion over his duster. He didn't seem to mind the slashes of lightning or the rumbling thunder at all. Perhaps this was because he was used to the lowing and mooing of the cows in Speedy's barn. It was certainly good he was not like a big collie dog Jerry knew named Lassie, who had to be locked in a closet during thunderstorms. Otherwise, she would manage to get out of the house and run away like mad in the rain, not remembering where she lived or who she was or anything. Ginger, on the contrary, slept as peacefully through the storm as if it were a lullaby. Since Ginger was now asleep, and since Mamma would not let Uncle Benny wake him up, saying, let the poor thing rest a while, and since dinner was still not ready, Jerry and Uncle Benny went down to the cellar to hammer and pound. Mamma was busy stirring the food in pots and pans, and the kitchen smelled as though they were going to have roast lamb. Rachel set the table in the kitchen because Papa was still away. Even though it was Sunday, they always ate in the kitchen when Papa was away, saving a lot of time and steps. Then Rachel went into the living room to wait for dinner, which smelled unbearably good. It was a terrific thunderstorm, but once it got started, it was over in 10 minutes. The thunder had boomed, the lightning sizzled, the rain splashed down, horse chestnuts had fallen from the tree, and the birds were silent. When it was over, Rachel felt as though the world had been born anew. She had spent those 10 minutes of big storm in the big armchair doing nothing but appreciating the storm. When no more rain was falling, except big drops pelting slowly from the horse chestnut tree and the roof, she returned to the kitchen. Would dinner ever be ready? She wondered. That was what Jerry and Uncle Benny were wondering too, and they pushed open the cellar door, looking grimy as stokers on a ship and almost starved. Jerry listened. The storm is now 3 miles away, he said, counting between flashes of lightning and lazy thunder. 3 miles, said Uncle Benny, admiring Jerry's knowledge. They all sat down to dinner, which at last was ready. Ginger woke up and came and ate his dinner under a little settee beneath the kitchen window. Ah, Ginger, ginger pie, said Rachel affectionately, making a loving face at him, as one does to babies. Ginger, ginger pie, thought Jerry. The name did sound good, the way Rachel said it. During this whole day so far, there had been no sign of the mysterious footstepper, the man with the muddy mustard hat. Dinner was still going on. They were up to dessert, Jell-O with sliced bananas and powdered sugar on top. Uncle Benny was sitting in Rachel's old high chair, and from it he could see out the little window over the sink better than the others could. All of a sudden, he said, I see hot! I see hot! Hot was the way Uncle Benny always pronounced hat. Forgetting this and thinking he was just remarking on the food, at first no one paid any attention to him. But since he continued to point out the window over the sink, exclaiming, hot, hot, it suddenly dawned on Jerry that maybe it was the hat, the odd yellow hat that Uncle Benny was talking about. Jerry ran to the window. It was! There was a queer yellow sort of hat, just like the one he had seen on the person racing across the fields at Mrs. Speedy's, and it looked as though it was glued to the side of the fence. The person must be looking through a knothole. If Jerry got there fast enough, he would see who this was anyway. He tore out of the house, followed by Rachel and Mama, who grabbed Uncle Benny out of his high chair. But by the time Jerry got to the fence and climbed up on it, the snooper had disappeared. Jerry jumped down and raced to the corner, but he didn't know which way to turn. There was no trace of anyone anywhere. If Jerry hadn't seen that hat too, he would have thought Uncle Benny had made it up. Reluctantly, he returned home, and he looked through the knothole the man with the hat had been looking through. He would nail it up. Did you see anything of the man but his hat? Asked Jerry to Uncle Benny. Really, it would not have made any difference if Uncle Benny had seen the entire person, for all men grown-ups looked alike to him, and all ladies grown-ups looked alike. Only children seemed different from one another to him. Just saw hot, said Uncle Benny. So they still knew nothing more about the unsavory character than they had before, except that he had become a very real person to whom the pies had to watch out for. Can you see the little hat on the edge of the fence? Unsavory character. It sounded like a name. Unsavory could be his first name and character his last, suggested Rachel. Like in colonial times. It sounds like one of those names. Said Jerry. What did that person persist in thinking he could get a hold of that puppy? Ginger belonged to the Pies. He already had a name, Ginger Pie, and he already had a little leather collar around his neck made out of one of Rachel's old skate straps. Anyone could see he really belonged. As soon as he was old enough, they'd get a license for him. And to keep him safe and sound, they wouldn't let him out of the backyard by himself until he was old enough to bark like the dickens and even bite if anybody tried to take off with him. Moreover, if Unsavory continued to snoop around, they could tell a policeman. They could describe his hat, and the policeman would catch him. Let the man watch out, or he'd land in jail, the Cranberry Jail, where nobody had landed for 10 years. That was the way the Pies were talking as they went into the house and made sure the doors were latched. Who latched doors in Cranberry in the daytime if they were home? Maybe Judge Ball, hardly anyone else. But the Pies latched theirs today, all right, in case Unsavory should come back. However, they didn't see any more of him or his hat this day.